Hello, everybody. This is just a follow-up to the Story So Far Proper Dose episode. It was a production and mixed deconstruction of that song. Had a bunch of, guests. Sam Pura, the producer of the record, was involved. Some band members came in. They talked about their experience with it. If you haven't seen the episode, it's a cool one. Bunch of stuff in there. It was really fun. And there was a bunch of great questions. I wanted to answer these. So let's dive in and start going. This is all Proper Dose stuff. And these are all questions that came in on the Audionaut website. There are comments on the video on that website. So the first one is there any chance of you uploading some sort of an EV most frequently used sample pack with the Ice Cube kick sample, breakbeat kick, and whatever else you're frequently using to reinforce drums? I'd be happy to do that. It's interesting. I've accumulated a bunch of samples, but that was really, stuff that was happening decades ago. The stuff that I'm doing now, there's just less reason and opportunity for me to use samples with the things that I've been working on more recently. I use them occasionally, but not as significant a part of my process now as it was then. So, I'm perfectly happy to share those. I'll find a time to do that, and I can put together like a bank of kick drums, bank of snare drums, samples that, have been sort of like, the most frequently used, as you put it. So this was from Joe Ippo68 was the username on that. So totally. I'll do that for sure. I'm also planning on creating some sample banks, like really more definitive sample banks, now that I'm in this place. I think it's an incredible sounding room, especially for like big rock drums, stuff like that. So I plan on doing that as well. Kind of like a more organized version of this, where it'll be the whole drum set and, all recorded properly and all that stuff. But, the samples that I use are often samples from other recordings, so it's just a stereo sample from somebody else's record or something, but they can be useful just to blend in with a live performance. So cool. I will totally try and find time to do that at some point. All right. Okay, next one. Let's see. I'm gonna do the name first. So this is username Owen Korzek, and so this one is. It almost sounds like on the first hit of the chorus. Of the first chorus, the whole mix is automated like 3 dB louder for a bit to really make an impact. Not sure if you described that in the video and I missed it, or is this a byproduct of the arrangement, performance, or original production mix? I know there's some sounds ramping up into it, but the landing sounds especially strong. Would love to hear what aspects do you think contributed to that. Yeah, I don't remember if I specifically referred to it in this video, but your guess is right. I definitely turned things up on the downbeats of choruses or significant transitions. I have the session here. I can just show you really quick what's going on. So here's the first chorus. You can see it right there. Here's the marker for it. And right out of the gate, you can see this move that's happening on all the guitars on the downbeat of this chorus. There's this push, and then it sort of fades away. And so this is, let's see what this is. So that's 10 dB there, 14.5 dB there. So this is, 4.5 dB push of the guitars just on the downbeat. And this volume increase is happening. These guitars are being pushed into a compressor. So there is more volume, but it also gets more compressed, and you hear the compressor sort of grabbing just under the weight of all this extra volume. And in theory, it should make it more exciting and thicker and aggressive and all that stuff, because it's louder and it's more compressed. So it's sort of scanning through here. So this also looked like there was a boost here right around the chorus. What is this stuff? This is kick samples. So the kick drum got pushed here. Looks like I turned up the room sound stuff going in just these 3 drum hits leading up to the chorus. And then, then there's a snare sample that gets turned up in the chorus. Here's more stuff turned up for, more kick stuff turned up on the downbeat. Here's the guitars. The guitar master, there's a little bit of a push there. So it's happened on the individual tracks of the guitars and happened here. So that one is a full dB on the guitar bus. So, there are things being turned up on the downbeat. And, as I said, in theory, when you turn things up into the compression, it helps sort of glue it together so it doesn't hopefully it doesn't sound like somebody just moving the fader on the mix. It shouldn't feel like that. It should, sound a bit louder, but it should also sound more aggressive, more compressed, all of that. So that's what's happening there. Okay, next question. This is from username Jack S. Byrne, I believe. And it says, there was a moment that I noticed around 135 when you bring all the kick and snare mics back in against the overheads. The volume of the cymbals changes dramatically, almost to the point where there's a tonal shift going on as well. Was this an automation move happening in the background, or maybe something later in the signal chain? Okay, I checked this out. It's at an hour 35. And what's going on here, when I do these videos, when I solo something, often the volume that it's set at to be part of the blend of all of the other stuff is so quiet when I'm trying to talk about settings and stuff, and I'm talking over it, that what I'll do is I'll gain those up while I'm talking over that particular part. And then once it goes back to being blended in, everything goes back to its normal volume. So that's what was happening there. While I was soloing just the overhead mics and talking about the settings on the overhead mics, I turned them up so you could hear them more clearly in relation to me talking and all of that stuff. So that volume difference was not a part of the actual mix. It was really just to facilitate being able to hear it as it was being discussed in the video. So hopefully that makes sense, and that's what you were hearing there. Okay, so now we've got username James Kirsch. Says, is it possible that Sam can share the guitar pedal chains and amp setups, please? Those tones are really choice. Sounds like some cool distortion pedals were used for different flavors, and would love to know what they were. Sam was very generous, sharing pictures and notes and all kinds of stuff, and he seemed, perfectly happy to share as much as people wanted to check out. So I'll try and follow up with him and see if he wants to do that. Then maybe we can do another follow-up on this video and share some more details about guitar stuff, because I agree, they're really cool guitar sounds. Really cool recording. Sam did an amazing job on that whole record. But we'll see. I'll try to make that happen. Okay, so now next one is username Julian Kaufman. Says, I've been noticing that on the mixes you redo in the new studio, the cymbals tend to be very loud. Do you think this is because of your evolving taste in louder cymbals, age-related high-end hearing loss, or something else? Curious for your thoughts and really appreciate everything you do. It could be a combination of both. I think I am making an effort to have the cymbals sound more natural, and, in the past they had just sort of gotten obliterated in a sea of compression, big wall of compression, and the cymbals were just kind of background noise instead of really sounding like an instrument that's being played. So I think that part of it is intentional. So I want to hear the cymbal just go and decay away. And it's also possible, I know that with age, my high frequency sensitivity, the very extended high end, is just going away. It just happens, I'm aware of it because I have to calibrate tape machines, and I calibrate with 10K, 15K, all that stuff. I can still hear 10K perfectly fine. 15K is starting to get a little more challenging. I got to turn it up more to be able to hear that. Not the way it was when I was, in my 20s, 30s, whatever. So that's possible too. And I am aware of it, and so I'm starting to use visual references a little more when I'm mixing stuff, just to make sure that there's nothing above 15K that's just way out of whack, just poking out up there that I may not be aware of because I can't hear it, So it's just a thing. It's a thing that you got to deal with when you get older. But that's a good question. Okay, so next one is username Sam Belay, and it says, on your listening setup, the speakers look spaced a little broadly, like if you're not following the equilateral triangle rule. Distance between the speakers and your listening place make an equilateral triangle. Am I correct? How do you go about placing your speakers and your listening spot? Yeah, I wasn't aware, I don't remember hearing that there was a specific rule that it would be an equilateral triangle. Jürgen Strauss, the gentleman who designed and built these speakers, he recommends a particular distance for these speakers, and I'm very much in that range that he recommends for the speakers. And then the width, when I got these speakers set up, I played with that, and I've always sort of placed speakers more by ear than by a specific formula. I definitely try to make sure that they're symmetric in the room, so like the speakers are the same distance from the outer wall, they're the same distance from the back wall, I try to make it very much symmetrical in the room. But as far as the width in front of me, I played with that a lot when I was positioning these speakers. And I started with them closer together. And the trade-off is that when the speakers are closer together, they will definitely be punchier sounding, but you don't have as wide of a stereo presentation, obviously. And so, when I had them closer together, it just didn't feel like the sound was really sort of wrapping around me in a cool way. And so I just played with it until I got a cool sort of balance between those two things. They still feel really punchy. And the stereo imaging in here is really wonderfully wide. Like you really experience it, very, very clearly in this room sitting between these speakers. You hear all the width of the reverbs and the space and room mics and pannings of things and stuff. It's all very apparent on these speakers. So maybe it's a little wider than you're supposed to or other people like, but man, they've been sounding amazing for me. So I just did it by ear. I just did it until it sounded cool, pulled up a bunch of stuff that I love listening to and fussed with it until it all sounded great. But good question there. Okay, moving on. So this is username JP. And the question is, do you have any method for testing saturation plugins? When I tried Slate Tape, I found that it only could make things sound better when it was actually adding voltage. And if I matched the peak, I could see that it was only adding a ton of mud. Never liked it because of that. With a saturation plugin, I want to be able to rise perceived loudness, maintaining the same peak level. Maybe I'm too strict or I'm missing something. What's your view on that? Thank you. Sometimes with saturation plugins, sometimes I will take a peek just to see what they're doing. And, that spectrum analyzer in the FabFilter Q3 or Q4 or any of those equalizers that FabFilter does, that spectrum analyzer is very useful for that. You can, it will just lay out in front of you visually what the harmonic series is, all the distortion harmonics that are showing up, and what their volumes are relative to each other, and what it is relative to the fundamental pitch. I'll put like a 1K signal in there and just see what it does. And then beyond that, the distortion stuff is more of a feel thing for me. Like when I'm adding the saturation, either it's making this thing feel and sound more musical or more just cool in some way, more pleasing, exciting, whatever to me, or it's not. And, plugin designers just cannot seem to resist the temptation to have the processed signal be louder as you add the processing. But it makes it much harder to evaluate. Most of those plugins, when you're adding the distortion, like the new Arturia J37 tape machine plugin, which I really like, is really great. When you add distortion, I think it's supposed to be compensating for the level, but it doesn't do a very good job, because as you add the distortion, it sounds way fucking louder than when you bypass the thing. And I'm always having to turn it down and try and compare it at a similar volume to see do I actually really like this better, or is it just louder, And so that is important. That's probably the most important thing, and I think you realized it with the Slate tape machine emulation, that once you actually match the volumes, really didn't seem that much better. That's a great test. And as I've been using more and more of these recently, I'm being more careful to make sure I match the volume, make sure I actually like the tonality of this better, and it's not just louder. So I think I would certainly recommend that, and I wish that plugin designers would be better about that. It's very tempting, because you're trying to sell plugins, and when the processed version gets louder, even just a little bit, even sort of like a subliminal bit, that can influence people into saying that's better. So it's a pretty irresistible thing to do. Okay, so next one is username Forest Casual. And the question is, do you think this mix would have been radically different if you'd started completely fresh? It seems there was a lot of stuff that came pre-assembled, drum samples, guitar stuff, mixes. Did you find that limiting at all when working on this record? Would love to hear a bit more about your process handling records that you're mixing rather than producing entirely. That's a good question. I don't do a huge amount of that, but I do at times. I mixed a Weezer record for Butch Walker, and he just gave me his Pro Tools sessions where he had left off with them. And, on that one, I did go through the process of just, purchasing the few plugins, the handful of plugins that I didn't have that were being used in the session. So when I pulled it up, I was really sort of hearing it the way they left off. And I thought that was important for me at the time to just know where they were at, what they were digging about this rough mix, and if there was stuff in there that was useful. There are certain things I would say in an existing mix, like a specific delay splash on a thing or whatever, like some very specific choices, not just the overall EQ and compression, but actual effects that are sort of cumbersome for me to have to recreate. And so I like having those in place, so if it's like, oh, cool, they did a delay throw on this thing, I will just leave that and not have to rebuild it and automate it and do the whole thing and just use what they did. As far as the overall tonality, EQing, compression, distortion, coloration, stuff like that, that stuff I often will kind of start over. And so, go into all the individual drum tracks, remove everything, and just start over. I typically have, a specific way I like to bus things and EQ things and do stuff to get it to feel the way I like to, hear things. And so, it's unlikely that the session's gonna show up with it set up that way. So for that stuff, I typically just, pull it all off, starting over with that. I remember, with Sam's stuff, there was, he had this sort of like universal busing system that he used for all of the songs, I believe, in the record, so he could jump from song to songs and things would come up formatted basically the same way. And it was one of those types of busing setups that was designed to be able to accommodate kind of anything, whatever song came up. And so it was more complicated than it needed to be for specific songs, at least the way I approach things. And so I typically undid that and then just did a simpler busing structure, for each song that sort of, made more sense for, my mixing approach. When I wasn't trying to have a universal setup that just works for everything. It's just sort of a different thing that you're trying to achieve there. And so, it didn't make sense when I was just focusing on mixing specific songs. And then, with the samples and stuff like that, there was, I tried to stick to the samples that were there. There was definitely a lot of care and thought put into what was being used. And I didn't just want to go like, I'm just going to change this, switch to a different sample, whatever, screw this. I definitely wanted to start there. I did often go in and double check just levels, because that trigger plugin that he was using can have a bunch of samples loaded into it that are being blended and have phasing choices and stuff like that. So I would check that every time. Like, do we really need all of these samples? Are they really blended in a way that makes sense to me? Is the phasing right on all of these things? Is all of that really adding up right? Wouldn't take a huge amount of time, 5-10 minutes, just kind of muting, unmuting, soloing, flipping phase, stuff like that. It's like, oh, okay, cool, this makes sense. And, sometimes there was some in there. I think there were some examples of places where it's like there's all these samples going, but I really narrowed it down to just these couple that I thought were the most effective. So, you kind of make your choices as you're flowing through the process and try and find a balance. There's always more things you can do. You can always dig deeper into stuff, and you just have to decide like what is really worth your time and attention and what things are not, to get to an end goal quickly, while trying to address all of the really important stuff to get the result that you want. So I'm always trying to balance that. In a creative project, nothing is ever done. You just choose to be done because there's always stuff you can try. Okay, next one. This is username Rome8180, and the question is, Oh, this is more a comment, but I thought I would share this because I agree with this. So thanks for alerting me to the magic of CQ. So this is this plugin from Soundtoys that is based on a Siemens, very simple 3-band equalizer. I've had the Soundtoys bundle for a long time, but I've never used CQ because it just didn't look that interesting or useful to me. I had the same journey with it. I didn't try that plugin until I had gotten one of the original pieces of hardware. It's a very unassuming little plugin. And then goes on to say, but man, is it good for boosting mids and highs? I hate when people describe an EQ as musical, but I don't really have a better term for it. You can boost a ton and it still sounds great. Any insight on why it sounds so gentle and smooth? Does it use a really wide Q or something? Yeah, I agree. It's just a very, very musical sounding EQ, for lack of a better term. And it is definitely adding harmonic distortion. So you can see that if you put a tone through it and then put, Q4, FabFilter Q4 after it, you'll see the harmonic overtones popping up in there. And that thing is definitely, as is the original, is what you would call proportional Q. So like a lot of early equalizers, a Pultec does this, an API does this, that Siemens EQ does that, Neve EQs does that. Most equalizers will do this because the filters naturally do this in the way that they interact with being amplified. And so they will show up as proportional Q, meaning the more you boost a frequency, the narrower the Q gets. And I think that relationship can be very musical. So if you're putting more gain on something, if the Q stays really, really wide, it becomes a much more dramatic EQ change. There's one EQ that doesn't do that. That is the undertone audio EQ. That's what's called constant Q. And so we chose to do that, I think, and I still feel like it was a good choice for that equalizer. I wanted to have more control over the Q. I'm going to set the Q where I want it, and I'm going to be able to boost it up and down and have it stay the way I fucking set it, and not have it just, varying with the gain adjustment. So you can hear the difference, with an undertone EQ. It's a different experience when you boost on an undertone EQ. The boosts feel more dramatic because it's not narrowing down and everything around it comes up, in a way that I think most people don't expect. So it can happen differently, but I think in the case of that EQ, because there is no Q control on it, and so it follows that very organic relationship between gain and bandwidth. The original designers, they chose a particular bandwidth as a starting point, and as you start turning up gain, it just gets narrower and narrower. And I think they really got that relationship right on that EQ. So when you're boosting a lot, it's really more specific on the frequency that you have chosen. So it's not adding a bunch of other frequencies that you may not necessarily want. So I think that's part of it. That may be what, is working about that thing. So proportional Q, I think, is definitely helpful if you don't have a Q control. The undertone EQ has a Q control with a super wide range of adjustment. You can go from a Q of like 0.2 or 0.3 all the way to a Q of 10 on that thing. So, all those settings are in there, and it's not changing it when you change the gain. So just a different way of doing it. All right, so now we've got same gentleman. This is, again, username Rome8180. And this is another comment. It says, the bass track labeled B7K would be the Dark Glass Microtubes B7K pedal. I think in the video I was like, this one says B7K, I don't know what that is, I don't know. So thank you for clarifying this. I'm not familiar with that pedal and had no idea what the reference was, so this is helpful. It could also be the Neural DSP plugin, which emulates that pedal, but I'm not sure that plugin existed in 2018. I certainly have no idea. More likely it's the pedal. Either way, that's a classic dark glass tone. Yeah, it's a very cool sound. So thank you for sharing that. Now we can have a better idea what was used on that thing. Okay, so then we've got Username, cue the noise. The question is, did you use the API 2500 on the mix bus on the original version of this or the Smart C2? Did you end up getting rid of the C2 because you're not an SSL guy? I did use the 2500 on the original mix. I recalled this, pretty much exactly to the original notes and then made some tweaks from there. So it was the same compressor on the original mix. And at the time, I think I did have the SSL around, the C2. I hadn't gotten rid of it yet. Yeah, I still had it in 2018 for sure. And the C2, at the time, I was just finding I wasn't using it that much. And I just wasn't getting picked, And it's interesting how gear gets chosen for me, because it's not, I don't really think about it intellectually. Like the equipment, whether it's a microphone, a compressor, an equalizer, they get sort of cataloged in my brain more as a feeling than a particular technical reference. And so when I think of an SSL C2 compressor, what it evokes is this sort of compression feeling that I'm familiar with when that thing goes on. And so I'm considering how it makes me feel when I'm deciding whether I want to put it on a mix or not. And so, or put it on any element. And so, that was a feeling that I just wasn't craving for a long period of time, and I got rid of it. And I got to say, I'm kind of missing it more recently. So I went through this kind of arc where, I had a very sort of broad array of outboard gear. I had, the C2, I had this Cranesong STC-8, I had a whole bunch of other, solid state outboard compressors that were hanging around. And as I made the transition here, I was really, I was into this idea of like using outboard gear that just had a heavier sonic footprint than stuff like that, than like the C2. And so I mostly kept all of my really vibey tube gear when I made the transition to Vermont and built this studio. And so, I've got on Fairchilds and these old Altec modified compressors, LA2As, a copy of LA2As, Gates stay levels, UA 175s, bunch of very old tubey mic preamps. Like, it's all very, super tubey, old vintagey sounding stuff. And so it's been really cool for a long time, but I'm finding that I do need, at times compression like the C2 or the C1. Both of those worked great for me. I think I bought the C2 a little bit later on, but on, let's say, on the Third Eye Blind album, I didn't own an Allen Spark compressor. I rented one, and it was a C1. And so we used the C1 compressor on Semi-Charmed Life. It was on that mix for sure. So, I've used it and enjoyed it in the past, and I'm probably going to get another one. There's another compressor coming up that I got to see what happens with, but it's likely I'll probably bring that back into my world again. It's a great compressor for sure. Okay, moving on. This is username Nolly, and okay, so this is an interesting comment. It says, you have no idea how illuminating your comments about the Punch Kick sample are. I'm not sure if you're aware, but that sample got into the hands of Machine and John Feldman. Not sure who Machine is, but I certainly know John. And it became a staple of their sounds before propagating through engineers who worked for them to become the literal sound of the current commercial metal genre. I've never been able to trace it to where Machine and Feldman got it from until watching this. So cool. Okay, well, that's really interesting. I think it probably got passed on to Feldman when I worked on the 5 Seconds of Summer stuff. And so I did I did that one song from their first record, and then I mixed a whole album that Feldman worked on with them, and I think I definitely was using that kick on that stuff. And so I either just gave it to him, he may have asked about it, I don't remember now. If he asked about it, I would have been happy to give it to him. But I may have given the final mix sessions back to him, and they were probably in there, and he, discovered it in there and started using it, which is great. I took it off of an old breakbeat. So, and I'm just happy that it's making the rounds. I think that's really cool. It's a great kick sample. It's so funny because it just, like that I would have never had that kick sample in my life if I hadn't worked with the rapper Paris, Oscar Jackson. He had, in the 80s, a bunch of these DJs made these breakbeat records where they would find a drum performance that played by itself from a song, they would loop it and they put it on a record, and so DJs could scratch with it, or make songs out of it, and so I got it off of one of those records. I've never found what the original source was for that thing. It'd be interesting to hear, a source that hadn't been pressed to vinyl multiple times, Maybe it made it cooler. Maybe the original won't sound as cool as that. But if anybody knows what the original thing is for that, it'd be very interesting to hear. But very cool. I'm glad people are enjoying that kick sample. It's a good one. Okay, so now we've got username maybe Lori Hakkinen. I hope I got that right. Okay. So the comment is, it seems like you like to use FabFilter plugin for low frequency boost on the bass drum and snare drum instead of using some emulation plugin like Neve, SSL, or API. Could you tell me more about this? Also, I would like to know why you are not an SSL guy. Okay, more SSL stuff. So it's similar to the way I worked outside of the box. So when I was really trying to shape the low end on a kick drum, I found that I always needed a lot more precise control over what I was doing. So really precise control over the bandwidth, what frequency I'm on, stuff like that. The difference of maybe 4 or 5 hertz of the frequency when you're trying to find the right frequency to boost on a kick drum can make a huge difference. You don't have those options on an API 550A. It's great sounding EQ, but if my ears want to hear boosting exactly 67 hertz, I can't do that on the 550A. And so when I was EQing kick drums and snare drums, I would always use either a GML, a Massenburg, what was that thing? The 8500, I think? I forget the model of it now. But the Massenburg parametric EQ, or one of the Orban EQs. Those were the tools that I used because they had constantly variable control for frequency and Q and gain. I could get it exactly where I wanted it. So it's the same thing in the computer. FabFilter is an amazing version, a digital version of what those more surgical analog EQs used to be able to do. And so I just use FabFilter for that because I know I'll be able to find what I want with that EQ. All of the options are available. So there's that. The SSL thing, I tried mixing on an SSL at times. There was an initial round when T-Ride first signed this production company, this guy named Wally Buck, who had a relationship with Fantasy Studios in Berkeley. He gave me the opportunity to try working on 2 different consoles because we had a crappy little Sound Workshop console that we were recording all of our early versions of the songs on. And he said, you need to, get your hands on a real console to see how it feels. So they had a Neve 8108 in one room. I think it was in Studio A. And then in Studio D, they had an SSL. And so I got to spend a whole day pulling up T-Ride songs and trying to mix them on the Neve. And I got to do the same thing on an SSL. In this case, kind of an odd comparison because the 8108 was after Neve had made the transition to using a bunch of ICs. So that Neve, in theory, was not that far off from an SSL, but it definitely really reacted differently when you mixed on it. And so, I did a round of mixing on the Neve, and I really liked those EQs. There's a thing, and at this time, when I had been working on that T-Ride stuff, there were EQ moves that I always did every time because I had done rough mixes so many times. Like when I bring the background vocals up, I'm going to need to turn down this frequency and turn up this frequency. I know I'm going to do that. And so when I did those moves on the Neve EQ, it was like, oh, okay, that sounds great. And when I started trying to do those same moves on the SSL, it didn't quite translate. And, I tried using the compression that was, built into those channel strips, but it was just very hard sounding. I was really used to just, these Summit Audio TLA 100s and stuff like that. I don't think I had gotten into distressors yet. This was too early for that. But the SSL, it was so unforgiving in certain ways. It didn't have this sort of like soft, gushy, thick sound. It was a very hard-edged sound, at least the way I was using it. And it was super unsatisfying for me. So that was my first sort of like, I'm not into this. And then there was another record that I mixed on an SSL. Did not love the experience. That record never even came out. It was a band called California. And so, yeah, they've just never responded for me. It's interesting. I listened to Rick Beato's interview with Glyn Johns. It's a really fun interview, and Glyn is an amazing, amazing dude. And Rick asked him, what his favorite consoles are, and he said, he really likes the Helios consoles. That's what was at Olympic, and he used those a lot. And he literally said, SSLs are diabolical. He says it's just the worst thing in the world. He hated that console more than anything in the world. So I guess I lean in that direction, and obviously they're very powerful. Plenty of people have made them sound incredible, and so there's a way to make it work for sure. And there's people that have done mixes on those things. Bob Clarendon Mountain's done a bunch of mixes on SSLs that sound awesome, and I love those mixes. And so he knows how to do it, but it's not my thing. So I don't know. You just go with what you feel, All right, so next one is username Eric Chesick, and okay, so let me get to the question part. Okay, the band mentioned that you took some liberties during the mixing. Do you try to work with the source material given to you to create new parts and textures? At what point might you add your own tracks from scratch if the sounds coming from your speakers don't match your vision? Yeah, for the most part, I always start off trying to work with what's there. And, in this case, I think the liberties that they're talking about, I muted some things at times and, maybe did some more extreme processing of some stuff at times, but it was always all the original source material with that record. There was plenty to work with on that thing. There are other projects, and it sort of depends on the context. When I mixed that 5 Seconds of Summer song that I just mentioned, the She Looks So Perfect song, it was a very different context, to that song. So that song had been passed around to a bunch of mixers, and they just hadn't really been able to get it there. And the song was really a demo. It was not a finished recording. It was a songwriting demo of the song. And so when it was given to me by the record company, and this is one of these circumstances where the band is really young, they don't have a huge amount of direct say in what's going on. They're just stoked and excited that they're about to have songs come out and be on the radio or whatever. And so it's really the label that is approaching me saying, we need to figure out what to do with this. Can you fix this, kind of a thing? And I contacted the gentleman that had done the demo just to make sure he was cool with it. I would never completely, tear something apart without asking somebody. And he was like, totally, go for it. That was just a demo. I don't care. Make it sound great. Do whatever you want, And so I was like, okay, cool. Here we go. And so on that one, I overdubbed drums. I replayed guitars. We did background vocal, gang vocals. Like, there was a ton of stuff that happened that got added to that thing. Because the stuff that was on there was really never intended to be, ready for release type recordings. And so it made more sense in that context. It really sort of depends on the circumstances and, what I'm given and how problematic it might be. But I generally don't just go rogue and start fucking replaying things or putting stuff on people's songs and stuff without asking first, for sure. So, yeah, I try to be very respectful about that. All right, so then we have username Declol, D-E-C-L-O-L, and this is a comment about the Evertune bridges, and it says, the bridges can bend like regular guitars, though a bit more effort due to the perceived higher tension, but you may not get along with them due to you liking tuning certain strings sharp or flat depending on the chord, etc. Yeah, because apparently it's a whole thing if you want to you know, change the tonal center of a particular string and have that sit differently all of a sudden, because it's always this balance tension is always trying to keep it right at a particular pitch. So yeah, so maybe, you know, maybe that wouldn't work. I still haven't installed one on a guitar, but you know, it's definitely a very cool idea and design. So okay, so these next ones, these are questions that came in through just the contact page on the Audionaut website. So this is from Matt Blackmore. It says, I may have asked this before, apologies if I have. I'd love an episode on how to deal with guitar noise, hum, buzz when not touching strings, etc., especially when dealing with high gain guitar sounds. Also, dealing with the guitar tuning when recording. I know Eric hasn't done a video on that. A refresher would be great. Okay, yeah. Yeah, the buzz, you know, I've had to deal with that at times. You know, with single coil guitars, it can be really dramatic when you take your hand off the strings. There's a lot of gain. It's just like, you know, and there's a part where the player is lifting their hand and you can actually hear it as their hand comes off. Or there's a, you know, a last chord that it's an open tuning and you hit it and you take your hand off the guitar and it's just like, you know, it can be a real problem. More of a problem sometimes I've had with bass, because there's a lot of times where bass player is playing an open string and it just buzzes more. So one of the things that I've done to deal with this is I'll take a little alligator clip and clip it onto the bridge of the instrument and slip it into the waistband of the player's pants. And so there's an electrical connection between the instrument, the grounding of the instrument, or there's, I should say, a ground connection between the grounding of the instrument and your body all the time, even when you take your hands off. And so that prevents it from changing. And the instrument is supposed to do that. You know, it's part of how the grounding is designed on these things. There's just a benefit of when your hands touch, your body becomes part of that grounding network and helps ground the guitar better. So, you know, other than what I just described, having a ground connection between your body and the guitar, other than your hands, is the only way to get it to stop from changing when you take your hands on and off the instrument. So I've definitely done that. You know, it's not always an issue, but if there's enough gain and the part, you know, is subject to having moments where the hands come off the instrument, it's a problem. So that's how I've dealt with it. And then, you know, there are some interesting things about dealing with buzz and stuff. I'm going through it right now with my pedal steel. It's an old Fender pedal steel. It has what look like sort of Jazzmaster style single coil pickups in it. It's very buzzy. So I've been working on that and I improved it a bunch. That thing, I don't know if it got lost over time, but there's no plate that goes over the electronics for it, you know, underneath the instrument, because, you know, there's a volume and tone control and a switch to switch between pickups, and then underneath is where all the wiring is, and it was just exposed underneath. And so I went in, I made a custom mu metal plate to cover all of that stuff up, and it made a pretty significant difference. It probably dropped, you know, all of the buzz at least in half on that instrument. And then right now there's a pickup maker that makes double coil pickups for pedal steels, and so I'm having him make a pickup for that instrument. He's actually, I had to send him the plastic cover for the pickup so he can match the footprint of it and all that stuff, and so I'm going to have that soon because I'm going to use that instrument with a lot of gain. I'm very excited about it. I love pedal steel, and I love using it in exactly all the ways that you're not supposed to. It's so cool for that. So that's coming. And so I don't know, maybe there's an episode there of just going through all of those kinds of tricks to try and keep things quiet. You know, there's the obvious stuff of being able to sort of change your direction. You know, electromagnetic fields in a room, they propagate in very unpredictable ways because there's a lot of things in the environment that are emitting them, and so they collide with each other. They'll cancel or reinforce in different places in the room depending on how they add up, because they're all at a frequency, typically 60 hertz, you know, in the United States. And so it's very random about how that stuff will get into the guitar. It can be super buzzy this way, and you can turn, you know, maybe less than 90 degrees and it'll go away, you know. So it's a very complicated thing. You know, I think I've talked about this before, but I did make, you know, a Faraday cage at one point. That was for the Lost Prophets record. We wanted to use single coil guitars with lots of gain. If you want to do that, it fucking works. So you have to build. We used pulled steel. It has, you know, the metal that you use has to have some sort of ferrous metal in it, iron in it to some degree. That's the stuff that will help shield from electromagnetic fields. And so we use pulled steel panels, and so you can see through them and you can hear through them. You know, the openings are these diamond-shaped openings that are maybe an inch long and half an inch wide, kind of a thing. And so, it's got to be all 6 sides. We put it on the floor, had 4 sides to this box that was 8 feet tall, and put a lid on it, and we tied it all together, and I made sure that they were all connected together electrically. You have to make sure they're all connected so it's one continuous grounding connection. And it was incredible what would happen. Like, and there was a door, you know, that was hinged on one side. You'd open it, and you could take a guitar that was, and when you put it inside that Faraday cage, man, the hum would just decrease dramatically. Go away. And you put it in there. And so we had guitar players inside this cage with monitors in there playing guitar, so we could use, you know, like Les Paul Juniors and Jazz Masters and stuff like that with tons of gain, you know. So there are ways to do it. Some, you know, it's not always easy, but there are always ways to approach this stuff. Okay, and this is somewhat timely because this is about this same band I was just talking about. Okay, so this one is from, okay, hopefully I get this right. This is Sergiu, maybe, Korolyov. And if you could please share in your next video how you made one certain effect in the song called To Hell We Ride by the Lost Prophets. The effect is in the right ear at 27, 124, 713. You guys can check it out. I listened to it. And the last effect is probably some sort of guitar effect chain with modulation. I don't think this is a guitar. So that band had a DJ, and part of the DJ's contribution to those songs was all these cool sound effects. And I'm pretty sure when I listen to that song again, that little boo, it's like this tone that sort of falls off. It's a cool, spooky sound that happens at the beginning of the verses, I think. And I think that's a sound effect that came from the DJ. It wasn't a guitar at all. But it's a cool sound. But you maybe a tough challenge trying to reproduce it with a guitar, because I don't think it was a guitar. You'll probably come up with something else that's also equally cool or cooler if you try and do it with a guitar. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that was a sound effect that came from the DJ. And I don't know where he got it from. His stuff, he just had a bunch of samples that he was firing off, and I don't know where they came from. So there it is. Okay, so now here's another one. So this is from another comment from Matt Blackmore, and this is just a suggestion about an episode. And so it says, clear you know your way around Pro Tools very well. I found myself curious about how you keep the flow of recording going so fluidly, not letting the software hold things up. A cool idea for an episode would be Eric Valentine's guide to using Pro Tools, playlist management, comping, track management, session management, etc. So yeah, I'd be happy to do that. You know, I've sort of settled on stuff that makes sense to me and I think is efficient and, you know, keeps things moving quickly. I could certainly do an episode about that. You know, there's a lot of ways to do it. You know, Pro Tools is an extremely powerful piece of software that you know, you can approach things a lot of different ways. And you know, and if I did it for Pro Tools, maybe there are features that are similar enough in other, you know, DAWs where they could be applied in other contexts as well, because I know not everybody uses Pro Tools. Probably less and less people are using Pro Tools these days. But I love the idea. I'd be happy to do it. Putting it on the list. All right. As always, thank you so much for all the wonderful questions and comments about things. I always appreciate people chiming in and giving me their thoughts and asking stuff, pull out more information on these episodes. I'm always happy to answer them. And so we'll see. You know, I think I'm pretty well caught up at this point. You know, there may be questions that come in about the Ozzy episode, other stuff, and you know, so I'll have more of these in the future. So until then, I will see you on the next one. All right, bye.